Well, good afternoon. And I wanted to talk about gender ideology and sexual orientation again, and just make some comments that more precisely set the record straight as far as what I believe and what I've been finding out. And just to show you a couple of introductory pictures, there's a toy stadium that I made in 1955. There's a dugout, there's outfield walls. We played a pinball stadium, and there's Brown Hall at William and Mary. There's McCullum Hall at the University of Kansas, both dorms I've stayed in. That's been torn down now, replaced in Lawrence, Kansas. And there's Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And let me get to the main talking points. Um, Gender ideology and transgenderism does seem kind of extreme um, when compared to homosexuality with gay men and women as we've thought of them, including myself in the past. Um, but both are rooted in non-conformity to some sex roles, especially reproduction. So conservatives can still try to link them together if they want to. Is something I've been very concerned about. Um, my own experience, I started noticing it in third grade, particularly. I had trouble with physical activities that required coordination, even tying my shoes, should be shoes, with my shirt tails, disinterest in physical tasks. I didn't learn how to do stuff like change tires very easily. All this improved during puberty, and I finally, got through my difficulties, got an undergraduate degree, went to graduate school, then was in the Army. But I actually had to go through a special training company in basic trainings. That's why I showed that Fort Jackson picture. When I was a boy, I basically did play with boy things, model trains, model cities with blocks, and then pinball stadiums and wiffle ball stadiums. Even though I wasn't real good at it, I got better at it as I did these things. And of course, I played the piano and composed. And piano, I think, is very gender and sex neutral, and so is writing, creative writing, writing fiction, writing nonfiction. Um, both sexes cross contribute skills in that activity. So it just doesn't make any difference in that kind of intellectual activity. Critical thinking, both sexes are good at critical thinking. It doesn't make any difference. I was, quote, hospitalized at the National Institutes of Health in 1962. That's documented in my book. And I'll just flash them up there right now. Um, Particularly the first book and the first chapter. And there weren't any physical abnormalities found or anything, but there were a lot of tests that you couldn't do then that you could do now, like where's your is your SRY gene really on the Y chromosome? Things like that. That I don't know for sure that there isn't something. And I'm 81 years old. I sensed my same-sex attraction to attractive men, probably starting when I was 12 or 13. And it was obvious to me by the time I was 18 and before entering college at William and Mary. And when I tried dating women when I was 28 in 1971, I had no desire for actual sexual intimacy. I just didn't. And that's kind of how it died, even though I thought it would give me more agency to do it, more power in a sense to have a family. And it would have. Now, let's just talk. The basic biology is that all multicellular life on Earth has two sexes. There's large gametes that nurture the young, and there's small gametes, sperm, that or pollen that provide more genes. And the reason for this would probably be true on almost any planet is that it facilitates the evolution moving faster, so that the organism is going to adapt to the environment. And practically all humans, are either have either male or female reproductive systems, and almost the same 50% probability. Very few people don't have there are very few people where that isn't actually clear. So this divides humans by biological sex, and within each sex, inevitably, some individuals are going to look better and perform better than others do in any kind of curve. And this is also true of older minors. Now, there are various papers around in Nature and at NIH particularly that looked at the brain substructures, and even though the different parts of the interior of the brain, the hippocampus and so forth, are the same in both sexes, the relative sizes can be slightly different, particularly in trans people, and there can also be differences in cisgender homosexuals, which are not quite the same as they are for trans. And cisgender gay people are still a lot more common. There's also the issue that the body has sort of like a database index to where all of its organs are. Your central nervous system has like an index file on a computer, more or less like a vSAN file or something. And it doesn't, and it could be inaccurate. And that is something that could rarely could lead to the sense that you're in the wrong sense or in the wrong body. So these kinds of situations come about late in pregnancy, whereas, the reproductive structures in your body, in an unborn child's body, are finished by about probably 20 weeks. But the hormonal factors and some of these other things, neurological factors, sometimes can be affected by events late in pregnancy. And we know that's true with later born sons of male children are more likely to be typically homosexual than firstborn sons. Although I'm an only child, by the way, so I'm an exception. Now, so a very small percentage of children might legitimately believe that they're in the wrong sex, even though they've had very little social conditioning from their parents or siblings or society. So there does seem to be something to this fact that a very small percentage of kids actually have some kind of inborn biological issue about gender identity. So, I'm going to give a reference I'll give you a reference in the notes, but the New York Times reported in 2024 that about 3% of high school students identify as trans now. Now, that's obviously not going to be people that have unusual physiological problems. That's people who, more like me, had some issues of performing according to the social expectations for their biological sex. There can be a lot of other reasons for that: autism, various kinds of other things that might happen. In my case, I had the measles when I was in second grade, so that might have, and measles affects the central nervous system sometimes. That might have contributed to my problems. Most assertive, boys are less assertive and thought of as feminine boys or free homosexual boys or something. What often happens is if you have a normal puberty, they completely outgrow it socially, except they still wind up being interested in men, but they'll have the same same athletic skills as any men have, and they'll be sometimes capable of playing in male professional sports like baseball and football. They'll have exactly the same kinds of physical responses and physical strength after puberty. Often they don't even remember that they were behind when they were small children. But Deborah So has written about this, that most gay men had some problems when they were very young and then outgrew them with puberty. completely and overwhelmingly outgrew, in fact. So medical issue, so you wind up with the idea that these medical brain structure issues can cause great behavioral change. They're very rare. It's not 3%. It's more like less than 1/10 of 1%, if that much. And until like 2010 or so, we're hardly seeing any discussion of this at all. So it's harder for activists to make an oppressed group out of a population when there's very few people in it. So the social contagion is what is leading to this 3% thing, particularly among girls, teenage girls. Now, there's also reports in the reference I'll give you the use of puberty blockers have doubled approximately from 2017 to 2021. But still, even though the numbers are much more than they were back when this gender identity stuff, started, there's still the number of people in an average school district, or particularly in an average high school, actually is still going to be very small. It's only going to be a handful in a typical large high school. So it's not like it's a large volume of people who actually are presenting themselves that way even now. The concept of gender identity has been known for a long time, back in the 60s even. Then there was John Money, of course, that horrible story. And it seems like it started getting taught in some grade schools around 2013 or so. We didn't hear very much about it in the media till maybe 2017 or 2018. And then there were a few cases. We started hearing about pronouns in cases where, like a case in Virginia, particularly in 2018, I think it was. The Bostock opinion about how sex applies to sexual orientation and gender identity came in 2020 during the pandemic. But gender identity is a concept that sort of crept into the law, and this idea of self-ID, which I didn't actually write here, it seems to have become accepted in the law, and in some countries it's written into the law. It seems circular, but it might be justified as if it's actually based on very careful observations made of someone when they're a very young child, and then the person asserts that they're the other sex, then it might really not be circular. But in practice, just allowing anybody to say, anyone to say they're a woman, claim they're a woman just by saying they are, would be circular, and that's a huge problem. Gender expression is a little different from gender identity, because gender expression is based on at least external ideas of what society expects behavior to be. Now, the need to teach gender to younger children in public schools, it seems to be driven in part by the availability of information on the internet, and also discussion of a lot of issues in the media. Gays in the military was one of those issues back in the 90s. Of course, AIDS in the 1980s even. But also the fact that people, myself included, self-published a lot of material, even before there were algorithms, which might have amplified the material. So the schools were kind of in a position where they had to teach something. And then there was all this stuff in academia and all this theory going on in academia about gender. So it was very convenient to talk about gender instead of biological sex. And you can see how this has grown since then. I mean, I've gone to gay picnics of the school district, and back in 2018, 2019, there would be a lot of gay people. There would be 3 or 4 trans people. But when I went to an event in 2022 and asked questions about it, I was thrown out of the event. It was in a total panic. So something happened late as we were coming out of the pandemic, 2021 and early 2022, to cause a lot more attention to be drawn to the issue of what was being taught in the schools, especially in Florida, the Don't Say Gay laws, and DeSantis and his derision of the pronoun Olympics and so forth. I noticed that as things reopened in 2022 coming out of the pandemic, that the tone of gay events was a lot more considerate of the trans issue and of the youth issue. Drag Queen Story Hour came about by a desire to change these attitudes. One of the things that drives the political motivation seems to be that many people see gender nonconformity as a moral issue. And so they'll have low opinions of people who don't conform to their um, to the norms for their biological sex, and regard them as less desired to have either in their lives as friends or as intimate partners or even sometimes as employees. So they want to break this idea of there's something intrinsically, some kind of connection to morality. So that's one reason why there's been a push to teach this to young children, particularly from the left. And of course, puberty blockers were motivated by an old Dutch model back in the 90s that you might be able to spare a young person puberty completely and let them transition to the other sex without ever having puberty. That isn't being born. And first, that sounded like it might work, but it seems like later data is tending to say that that isn't as safe as we thought it was. People, when they are in blockers, their doctors can monitor them, and yes, they can monitor for serious problems, but we don't know what's going to happen to the people when they're adults and what kind of lifelong complications they might have in this lifelong medicalization, depending on medicine. That isn't good. That might not be good, and this hasn't been studied very seriously. So, yeah, that's why I think the Cass report from England needs to be taken very seriously. We also have the fact that many people who live as trans adults don't transition at all, though. And that, by the way, explains why there was some controversy over bathroom bills, particularly in a few states like North Carolina back even before the pandemic. We were hearing about it, but not a lot, just occasionally. The idea that trans is an immutable identity group and not merely a descriptor of some less than normal behavior, and it needs others to affirm and offer some sort of inclusion, participation. That's important to kids that don't have any other agency in their life. It's not important to me as an adult, but it's important to people who don't have their own, haven't created their own path in life first. Now, the whole idea of gender identity, yes, it's related to Judith Butler's idea of performativity and actually Paul Rosenfeld's idea of polarity that I've talked about before. But that was back in the 1970s at the 9th Street Center that I attended. And it was never supposed to be a political label. It was just supposed to be something having to do with personal growth. It was just a private something in your own personality with your own friends. It wasn't supposed to be used for legal purposes. But of course, we've seen that that's changed. Generally, I think the women's sports problem is serious. It might be that athletic associations could be even more precise in the way they define their requirements. But once you've been through a male puberty, yeah, there are some sports where there would be an unfair advantage. And some states have banned all gender-affirming care for minors completely, even those that have started it. And some of the spectacular cases of kids like this that have been in some of the major newspapers and movies probably were people that actually had a serious physical or had a significant medical issue that had started in early childhood. States really shouldn't interfere with minors that have a known serious medical issue. But what they should do is regulate the standards that are followed in prescribing things. So I think Texas and Idaho and some of these and I lived in Texas for 10 years, by the way. So I follow what goes on in Texas. I have a lot of friends there. And yeah, I think some of those states have gone a little bit too far. As far as my own identity, I don't possess a separate gender identity other than my biological sex. So that may automatically mean I'm cisgender, but some activists would claim that means I'm agender or even non-binary. And I don't actually tell people what pronouns they have to use because I don't behave real, I don't behave in a real assertive way in business or in the way I conduct a lot of things. If they want to think of me as non-binary, I guess they have a right to do that. But that's really not up to me. And also, I just wanted to mention um, the sexual orientation issue. Going back to when I was in college, when I was in graduate and in living in dorm, straight men would talk about their desire for intercourse with women a lot. About a third to a fourth of people, particularly William and Mary Less at the University of Kansas later, would talk about this openly. So I think there's something innate about sexual drive in straight men that is kind of biological. That I don't seem to have that kind of drive. And others can not have that kind of drive and still grow up to be heterosexual men, though. I also wanted to, one of my beneficiaries of my trust, since I'm retired and inherited a trust, has been very active in this issue. And so it's a great concern to me because in a way I have some accountability for what's going on. So that's one of the reasons I'm talking about it. Just in closing, the radical left began to make visible demands of normies, you could say, after Trump started his first term and started talking about anti-racism and the silence is violence idea after the George Floyd riots and during the pandemic. And then more recently has taken up this idea of stolen lands, colonialism, and they assign blames to individuals based on which oppressor group they belong to, like emphasizing whiteness rather than their own personal performance in life, like social credit scores. I think that's something I've known that got much worse during the pandemic. The authoritarian forces around the world are becoming more dangerous. Russia, Iran, and so forth. They're behaving as if they see the world as a zero-sum game that might not get through the climate change issue. And so they might be the only people who want to be left. So that's a very dangerous thing for the entire rest of the world. They believe that the personal speech is really just propaganda. Russia is now actually passing a law and making it a crime to advocate childlessness. You see how far this is going, and they want to get their birth rate up. Hungary also has a law prohibiting showing any material having to do with unconventional sexual behavior to anyone under 18, and that could get duplicated here. Particularly the right has some connect. Has admired Orban and so forth. So it's something I'm very concerned about. I'm also very concerned about what the left might do with internet speech, but it's a little bit different. So we'll get into that. But I did want to make this statement today, and I do thank you for listening to it. This is still a very important issue, and thank you for listening.